Well, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to another scintillating, didactic, and provocative presentation, or journey, if you will, through business and its environment. Today, we have the exciting opportunity to talk about one of my favorite subjects, industrial pollution and environmental regulation. I think this chapter and its content present both, of course, ethical and legal questions that I think we ought to discuss and reflect on. The central one, which is really going to be the theme, if you will, for this chapter, is how much harm can a business legitimately create in its profit-making operations? I think that's a profound question. Do you have an answer to that right now? I bet most of us don't, because you need to think on that a while, because I think it's a deep, yet I think salient, that is, important question to ask. How much harm can a business legitimately create in its profit-making operations? Well, let's take a real example. Let's talk about open pit mining. We've all seen open pit mines before, coal mines and copper mines and so forth. Now, the reason why it's called an open pit mine is because surface dirt is removed by increasing the breadth of the excavation and, taking out, removing the coal or whatever the mineral is. And all the dirt, of course, has to be moved elsewhere while the pit is being enlarged. Well, there will ultimately come a day when the mine is mined out. That is, that there is no longer any copper or coal or whatever, or it becomes financially unfeasible to continue the business. Well, as we're going to see, that there are laws that require businesses to return land to the condition in which it originally was prior to the mine operation beginning. But what about the cost of replacing all the dirt and rehabilitating the land to its original state? Could we probably agree from the beginning that that's probably going to be a lot of money? In fact, probably more money than the business has available to invest in the rehabilitation. And so might not the business option of declaring bankruptcy for the open pit mine be a better business option under the circumstances? Because the company, of course, has already extracted its profit, and now it's only faced with, cost. And so walking away from the business activity and leaving the super fund, that is the taxpayers, to pick up the rehabilitation whenever the super fund has enough money to do that, which is a norm it never does, it raises the business ethical question. What is the open pit mine's ethical obligation under the circumstances? Now, it certainly has obligations to the shareholders, right? And Milton Friedman, the famous University of Chicago economics Nobel winning prize authority, would say the purpose of a business is to make money for its stockholders lawfully. Now, clearly, it cannot do so unlawfully, according to Milton Friedman. But he said, look, businesses aren't in the business of doing social projects or supporting charities. They are in the business of making profit for their shareholder owners, and that's it. So Milton Friedman might say that, look, bankruptcy financially of this subsidiary company, I bet it would be a subsidiary of a much larger parent, would make financial sense under the circumstances. What do you think about that ethically? Is that the right thing to do? Because as we previously discussed, ethics is all about correct decision making, right? Now, nobody ever said business ethical decision making is easy to do. In fact, in many cases, as in this one, it's a hard thing to do. And that brings us back to our original theme question for this chapter, which is, how much harm can a business legitimately do to the environment? I think that's a fascinating question that needs greater reflection. So let's take a look at our friends at Thomas Edison's company, General Electric. You're all familiar with the PCBs and reading about the story that related that General Electric, in its utility operations, polluted the Hudson River. Polluted it to the extent that nobody can even eat the fish from the river. The Hudson River, obviously, is a big river in New York. Now, once the Environmental Protection Agency determined that PCBs were highly unhealthy, they came after General Electric to clean up their mess. Well, what was GE's legal argument? They said, look, their research shows that stirring up and trying to remove the PCBs is more dangerous and unhealthy than leaving them undisturbed at the bottom of the river. Now, granted, nobody would ever be able to eat the fish, but it's a cost of doing business, right? Well, the EPA obviously didn't represent the public interest, didn't agree with General Electric, and fought them tooth and nail. Jack Welch, when he was the CEO for General Electric, fought the EPA not wanting to invest significant amounts of money in cleaning it up. Well, there was a change in leadership. Jeffrey Immelt became the new CEO. Jack retired, and GE changed its position. And so, while on the one hand, if GE walked away from it and declared bankruptcy for that particular part, because GE really is just a holding company, a parent company, has a gazillion subsidiaries, allowed that subsidiary to go into bankruptcy, the Superfund would be responsible for cleaning it up. And what's the estimated cost for cleaning up the PCBs in the Hudson River? Yeah, $1 billion. So that presents both a legal and an interesting ethical problem. Is it in the interest of General Electric's shareholders? For full disclosure, I will fully disclose I happen to be one. Is it in the shareholders' interest to declare bankruptcy and walk away from this problem? Or should GE attempt to remedy the environmental problem they've created by spending $1 billion of my shareholder equity? So that leads us to want to ask the question, well, come on, we need some guidance here. We need some bright line rule by which to decide, because we before have discussed ethics being defined as correct decision making. So how do we decide correctly? What rule are we going to use here? How about the medical profession's rule? Do no harm. Has GE done harm under these circumstances? Now, while it may not have been intentional, but there's no dispute, they are responsible for the PCBs. Do you agree or disagree? What do you think? Got to decide. So we're back to our good friend, French philosopher Voltaire. Before you address me, troops, define your terms. So what are our definitions that we need to consider in our ethical analysis? Pollution refers to the presence of substances in the environment that inconvenience or endanger humans. Think PCBs would qualify for that? No doubt about it, right? So pollution endangers human health. Nothing new about that, right? Pollution causes 11% of the disease burden in less developed countries, where in more developed countries it only causes 1%. Now, if you happen to be victimized by pollution, obviously, regarding you don't care about the percent, you're going to be angry at business endangering your health, because we probably ethically can agree business doesn't have uh, an ethical right to endanger the health of our citizens, of our people. It is true that as nations do industrialize, they evolve and develop values and interests to reduce uh, the dangers of pollution. And so I think that's GE is a good example of where GE in an earlier time in the 70s and 80s fought EPA, but we get ourselves into the 21st century. I think, not only GE, but the business community has evolved to the point to say, now, wait a minute. It doesn't make ethical sense that GE created this enormous health problem and that it should walk away from it and leave the taxpayers with an underfunded superfund to try and clean this up. That just doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem ethical under the circumstances. There's lots of evidence, right, to show that industrial activity does harm the biosphere. It can and certainly does to certain degrees degrade our ecosystem. And also certainly plants, animals, microorganisms that, all rely upon these ecosystems. A movie that I strongly recommend you take a look at online is Al Gore's. Al was vice president for 8 years under Bill Clinton, but he made this movie called An Inconvenient Truth, and I highly recommend it to you. So just go to Google, YouTube, and put in Inconvenient Truth, and it'll pop up, for which Al Gore received not only an Oscar for this movie, but he also won the Nobel Prize for the making of this movie. So this is a fascinating movie that discusses ecosystems and how these all rely upon one another in our, environment. Certainly, I think we would have to agree, and certainly our General Electric Hudson River PCB example demonstrates that economic growth has strained broad ecosystems. And so the effort today is to try and transform business operations into sustainability status. We'll talk more about that. So, what is sustainability in terms of definition? Sustainable development is non-polluting economic growth that raises standards of living without depleting the net resources of the earth. That's what sustainable development is. So, non-polluting economic growth. So as an ethical starting point, we would ask, does this proposed business activity create pollution? If it does, can't remediate it in some fashion, then our ethics would say, well, we're not going to engage in this because it's not sustainable. It just isn't healthy for our environment or for all of us who inhabit the environment. There's the infamous Kuznets curve that you need to be familiar with. What the Kuznets curve does for us is it indicates that pollution rises during the early stages of a nation's growth, then levels off and falls as public values about the environmental quality, if you will, evolve. and now begin to want to restrain, restrict, remediate business development and try and transform it into a sustainable trajectory. Certainly way back when, as we've already seen historically in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, economic expansion, boy, just about anything went, right? And so in terms of protecting the public health or workers' health, in the 19th century, there wasn't much protection to be had at all. And as we moved into the 20th century, times have changed, especially, capitalism got a black eye over essentially an anything goes for the sake of profit business ethic. But we can honestly say times have changed, right? Looking at some ethical models that, help us decide correctly, because when you're facing shareholders or you're facing corporate leaders, what ethics are you going to advocate in order to arrive at a correct decision? Now, as we've seen before, utilitarianism stands for, the greatest good for the greatest number. So that decision, that course of action, that business activity that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people would be considered ethical, okay? Now, there may certainly, following utilitarianism, create costs and harms. And the question becomes, what is the greatest good for the greatest number under the circumstances? So, while the PCBs that GE generated with their utility operations certainly created utility power goods for the New York community, when looking at the big picture, short term versus long term, now looking at the long term, boy, was the PCB operation, a prudent and ethical, business activity. So we certainly have seen at the end of, the 20th century and into the 21st century, as we're going to see even more, intense scrutiny of business activity, looking at the ethical, side of legitimate versus, if you will, illegitimate pollution activity. Leopold's land ethic says that, look, we humans, we're members of a much broader community of interdependent parts of nature that include land, plants, and animals. And so what we do, how we behave in business, certainly affects land, as in open pit mines, right? Plants, and certainly animals. So Arnie Ness's human domination of nature must cease, Arnie argues. Well, certainly everybody has a right to coexist and flourish, but certainly we do find that there is destruction of certainly land, plants, and animals for a greater benefit of building communities, expanding communities, and so forth. But the question becomes, is the activity sustainable under the circumstances? Again, you got to look at the long term just as well as the short term. So in the United States, and it's actually even more so in the European Union, agencies have been created to control, monitor, and remediate industrial pollution. So for us in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency is a very large agency who has the responsible for regulating pollution involving air, water, and land. So we're going to take a deeper dive to talk about what it is that they all do. So clearly it is the law is the Clean Air Act that was amended significantly in 1990. That's the primary regulator of air pollution. Now, how does the EPA go about regulating or controlling pollution? The EPA actually sets standards to curb emissions of 6 substances that are referred to as criteria pollutants. So these criteria pollutants have standards for emission, that is, limits as to how much a business can emit of any one or several of these pollutants. So we would all agree carbon monoxide is a pollutant, right? We should be able to agree nitrogen dioxide is a pollutant. Sulfur dioxide, ozone, particulates, and lead are all pollutants, right? And so while over the past 30 years, the aggregate emissions of these substances have fallen, the reason why they've fallen is because the EPA has not only set emission standards, EPA has annually lowered those standards, which have caused business. So, for example, coal is probably the best example. Coal has had to increase its scrubbers and other types of business activities to try and reduce its emission of these pollutants, okay? And so as the standards come down, obviously the technology and the engineering, improves to try and keep pace with the legal demand. And of course, there are sanctions. Companies have to pay fines if they exceed the EPA emission standard. Hopefully you've heard of acid rain. What is acid rain? It's the disposition of acids in rain or through other precipitation that causes the release of sulfur oxide and nitrogen oxide. Usually it's electric utilities that produce these puppies, especially in the northern parts of the United States. Illinois and whatnot has acid rain that goes over into, flows over into Canada, which kills Canadian forests, for which our Canadian brothers and sisters are very unhappy with us. So among the things that the Clean Air Act enforced by the EPA does is it set up an allowance system that permits a non-polluting or a reduced polluting company to sell, that is to trade its permit. So let me give you an example to another company. So let's assume for the moment company A, through technology and improved engineering, is able to reduce its pollution of those 6 elements by 25%. Well, another company is up against the max and really needs more authority to emit more pollutants. Well, the company A that has reduced its emissions can sell its 25% reduction permit, if you will, to a company that needs it. Now, it's important to understand that annually the EPA reduces the aggregate emissions and reduces the aggregate trade emissions. So the number continually goes down, which obviously produces pressure on companies like the coal industry to improve its emission scrubbers and other technology. Certainly indoor pollution is a problem, but guess what? The EPA really doesn't have any authority to regulate indoor pollution. You're familiar with pollution, ozone pollution, and so we're still working to try and reduce that. Greenhouse gases, certainly these continue to rise. The United States and China are the 2 biggest greenhouse gas emitters, big time, and we have a lot of work to do to reduce greenhouse emissions. Excuse me, boys and girls. All right, we've covered air. Now let's take a look at water pollution by industry. The Water Pollution Control Act, also known as the Clean Water Act, is the law that EPA uses to regulate water. Now, water is obviously the one thing that everybody needs, every business, every individual, every home, everybody needs clean water, right? And so the Clean Water Act, mandates that water is supposed to be drinkable. And we all know of circumstances where it is not. So let's take, for example, where I live here in Vermilion. About an hour up the road is Sioux Falls, and Sioux Falls has a park with the Sioux River running through it, and it's called Sioux Falls, the Sioux Falls Falls. But there's something interesting about Sioux Falls Falls. When you see the water, you see the bubbles and foam, and it smells like sulfur. Now, we would agree, I don't think that's drinkable. True. The problem is, of course, upstream, there are pesticides from farms and ranches that are seeping into the water, which is polluting it. So how does the EPA go about trying to improve our water systems and to improve their drinkability? They have a permit system for what are called points of discharge. So any company that is emitting pollutants of any type has to have a permit to do so. And yes, from time to time, the EPA reduces that permit ceiling, so people have to work harder and harder to try and prevent water pollution. And again, there is a trading system where a company can, purchase other companies' trading or permit authority. Our third area that we're taking a look at is land pollution, hazardous waste. Boy, do we create garbage, right? Boy, if we didn't have the garbage man coming around every week at my house, I don't know where we would put it. Well, the EPA controls certainly hazardous waste disposal sites through two pieces of legislation, what's called RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, that requires all sorts of expensive compliance measures, but also CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, also known as the Superfund, that endeavors to clean up hazardous sites that, of course, businesses like open pit mines have walked away from. The story in your chapter about the American Creosoting Company does illustrate the process of remediation, work, its expense, and the benefit cost issues raised by massive Superfund projects. So clearly those Superfund projects that are just enormously expensive and offer very little opportunity for public benefit, those cleanup operations move to the bottom of the priority ladder. Clearly those that are the most urgent move to the top of the ladder. I think the story in your chapter about the polar bear is an interesting saga to consider. Now, while most of us, would say, well, my only interest in polar bears is seeing them at the zoo. Yes, I understand that, but might the polar bears essentially be an ambassador, putting us on notice that the polar bear's plight is really the same plight that we are facing and going to face in greater complexity in the near future. And that, certainly our Earth's climate has changed in the past, like what happened to the dinosaurs way back when. We've had our interglacial intervals when, the Earth was covered with ice. But, what's happening, now? And is the polar bear a good illustration of what's going to be happening, to us? And so while the polar bear is becoming an endangered species, might not the environment, as we degrade it over a time and the disappearance of the ozone layer and the creation of greenhouse gases, might this over time poison us all? Have you seen the pictures of Beijing on a given day and the necessity for people to wear masks because the air is so polluted? Well, having lived in Atlanta 6 years, you should see what Atlanta is like in the summertime. How about Los Angeles in the summertime? Or Houston in the summertime. You should see the pollution from the humidity and, of course, the air that doesn't go anywhere. Well, how healthy is all that? Well, when I lived in Atlanta for 6 years, I was told that breathing the air in Atlanta during the summertime is the equivalent of smoking 20 packs of cigarettes a day. How does that strike you? Do you really want to live in an environment like that? Well, in 2003, I decided it was time to move to South Dakota, where the air is pristine. Polar bears would do fine in South Dakota. So the polar bear, I think, is a good ambassador or illustration of what happens when the environment becomes polluted. These icebergs, and so that where the polar bear inhabits, their disappearance has an impact. To every action, there is a reaction. And Mother Nature has a way of not taking dramatic changes lying down. She fights back from time to time. We certainly have seen that with Hurricane Maria last September. And so Mother Nature has been engaging in all sorts of interesting activities that really impact our environment in a variety of ways. So I think, the polar bear is a good representative of where we could find ourselves unintentionally, going. Increasing activity in areas where it didn't exist before, like, with the shrinking of the polar ice cap, now creating new shipping lanes. Well, shipping lanes obviously are going to create more trade routes and more pollution, right? Because, ships create a significant amount of pollution. Unless they're nuclear ships, like aircraft carriers, they certainly emit one or more of the 6 pollutants that I mentioned earlier. There certainly is chemical pollution of the Arctic food chain. And of course, carbon particles, combustion is something that affects all of us. Certainly tourism, too, affects the environment. So one asks the question, so what are we going to do? What should be done under the circumstances? Well, of course, even incremental change is still change. And our, Treaty of Paris that we backed out of, that the Obama administration signed us up to, but the Trump administration removed us from, was an effort, a group effort, an international effort to try and get all states to move together in the right direction. Look, I think we conclude today where we started. So, how much pollution is ethically permitted? How much harm can we ethically do to the environment and still, legitimately and ethically make money? I think that's an important question to ask ourselves and to write about because it is certainly a question in need of answering, and it is a question whose answer is going to affect us all. But with that, boys and girls, as always, I invite your emails. Let me hear from you. Any questions, issues, or challenges that you need assistance with, the Huckster is here to help you. Stay well. To be continued.